Check out today's piece of fan art. This one's pretty nuts. It's a depiction of a fan singularity, in which Emperor Justinian winds up summoning fictional characters like Star Wars' Darth Vader and Resident Evil's Nemesis. I doubt something like this would ever be canon, but I'll admit it does have me curious. Thank you so much, Iceland669. Welcome back to Otaku Daikun. Dai-chan here. At first glance, this video's title may sound like a first world problem, but at the same time, I think it's one that inevitably affects the fandom and deserves to be discussed. See, anime and games take a very long time to create. From the time we first experience a work to when it finally reaches a conclusion, our mortal lives go through countless changes. In some ways, we become very different people, and in others, we don't change at all. The process of experiencing anime content as it comes out, and how subsequent releases emerge over the following years, can actually explain a lot about the fandom at large. To start us off, I have a handful of personal experiences I'd like to convey. Square Enix is notorious at this point for teasing projects that may or may not ever actually release. Even when those projects do come out, they're practically being released to new generations. For instance, I remember seeing the trailer for Final Fantasy XIII when I was a sophomore in high school. The game looked absolutely amazing, and I was looking to the future of gaming by saving up for a PS3. Of course, the game itself wouldn't actually release until after I was in college. Similarly, we have Versus 13, later titled 15, which I knew about for just as long. Ultimately, that game wouldn't even be released until after I'd already earned my undergrad degree and was working a couple years at my first major job. A lot had happened to me during that time. My bright-eyed high school self moved out of the family home, attended college for 4 years, started renting an apartment, and struggled finding a way to turn my degree into a sustainable career. I'd both dated and got dumped by my ex-girlfriend, and later met and married my current wife, Adi-chan. I had no idea what the future held for me as I went through such a transitional period in my life, from teenager to adult, and it would be insane to expect me to hold on to that same excitement I first had from those games' trailers, all the way up to their eventual release. Of course, those were games I'd never actually played before. It gets even more complicated when it comes to continuing an already existing series. Again, back in high school, I remember beating Kingdom Hearts 2. I didn't touch the series again until the release of Birth by Sleep, which I played in college. While the series kept getting new releases, they hardly developed Sora's Quest, which had been left on the burner for years. It wouldn't be well after my college graduation that I'd finally gotten to continue Sora's journey in Kingdom Hearts 3, and even then, his story still isn't fully resolved. Mind you, I was around Sora's age when I played the first Kingdom Hearts, and nearly 30 by the time I played the third game. Sure, Sora himself aged a bit during that time, but nowhere nearly as much as I did. Oh, and that's nothing compared to good old Ash Ketchum from Pokémon. He was 10 when I was 10, and he's still not old enough to drink a beer. More on that later, though. A more recent experience, comparatively, is with the No Game, No Life anime. The anime aired in 2014, and to this day has yet to receive a second season. Originally, I'd lost all hope on it, but that was shattered by the 2017 release of No Game No Life Zero. While it was a prequel, and a very worthwhile entry in the story, it teased us right at the end by showing our main characters right where they left off at the end of Season 1. I took this as a sign that we might finally get that Season 2, but now, over 4 years later, we haven't so much as heard of one. That means it's been 7 long years since that story's Sora and Shiro had claimed victory over the Beastmen. 7 years is a long-ass time, enough for a middle school freshman to graduate high school. To be fair, this is an adaptation, and interested viewers can always go read the original novel it's based on, but that doesn't guarantee a story will finish much faster. Take Berserk, for instance. No joke, it's been running since 1989, making it as old as I am. I didn't even know it existed until 2004 when I'd seen clips of its anime in AMV Hell. Even today, it's obvious people are still interested in seeing Guts finally take his revenge on Griffith. But just imagine what this has been like for fans who got into the manga from the start. 30 years, man. 30! Enough for a young child to grow up and have kids of their own. Tragically, this manga's been in production for so long, it's outlived its creator, Kentaro Miura, who passed away earlier this year. Miura's assistants plan to continue the story using his notes, but even then, we still have no idea how long that will take. Mind you, the problem isn't that the manga is old, as I personally love to experience anime made before my time. Rather, the issue is how long it took to make. It takes a lot to keep eager fans interested in a story for 3 entire decades. It's quite possible their entire perspective on life changed over that time. Even fans joining somewhere in the middle will find themselves much older when and if the story ever concludes. I find it insane how fans in the future may be able to read all of Berserk in a single marathon, while original fans or the manga's own creator may not live to do so. Forgive me if this sounds cringe, but honestly, one of the reasons I look forward to living each new day is that I'll be able to experience the anime of tomorrow. There are plenty of stories I'm invested in that I lack closure for. Sadly, however, there will come a time when, even if an ending is on the way, I won't live to see it regardless of whether I'm still interested in doing so. For all I know, one of those stories might be Code Geass. As you know, Studio Sunrise has decided to continue Lelouch's story by following a cinematic universe that extends the ending of the original TV series. The show ended in 2008 and stayed that way for nearly a decade when, in 2017, Sunrise announced what we thought would be a 3rd season. That's when I made my Code Geass lore video, which was meant to hype fans up for the new entry. Even then, we wouldn't see this entry for another 2 years as the film Lelouch of the Resurrection. It got fans riled up for more Code Geass, making a big deal of how Lelouch would in fact come back despite his iconic death. The film was decent, but it was essentially a stepping stone for what people are expecting to be a real Season 3. In other words, it laid the foundation for more story, but seeing as it's been over 2 years since then, it's natural that fans aren't holding their breath over it. Those 2 years may turn into 3, 4, 5, or any number of years, as we can't predict the future. By the time it comes out, will we even care about Code Geass anymore? The trick to all of this is that we typically go into stories expecting them to end. For every dramatic question, we expect an answer. For every conflict, a resolution. When we get into a new anime or game, our first thought isn't usually to check and see if it ends on a cliffhanger. Typically, we're only aware of such things when they're obvious, like when Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced as an episodic venture. That means we only find out after we've already spent time investing in these characters and their future. Quite nefariously, this leaves us wanting more. We seek closure to those loose ends, which is one reason we might follow a story across many years with a sense of anticipation that might not even be deserved. Don't get me wrong, I still think another Xenoblade Chronicles X game would be a dream come true on all fronts. But I admit my main reason for wanting a sequel is to resolve the previous game's mysterious cliffhanger. It called into question the entire point of our journey through the game, with a twist that requires a sequel to resolve. I have no idea how much of the story is left to tell. It might only require a brief epilogue, something that could be added as a DLC chapter, or included on a potential Switch port. In some ways, I'd almost rather that than go through another game only for it too to end on a cliffhanger. It's honestly a great way for a storyteller to preserve interest in their work, but at the same time, it's cruel to audiences and should only be done if the author has every intention of actually making that sequel. Otherwise, it's a case of sick trolling. Zombieland Saga, for instance, pulled a baffling cliffhanger right at the end of its 2nd season, in which friggin' UFOs descend upon Earth and start attacking. The anime was all but ready to end with closure, but the last 15 seconds had to go and ruin that. I assume they're planning a movie, or 3rd season, but until that actually happens, I'm gonna be a bit salty about it. There's no guarantee a sequel is worth that risk, and I've come to appreciate anime that know when to end on a high note. After all, only a lucky few anime get those well-needed continuations. It's a pleasant surprise to know that The Devil is a Part-Timer is getting another season, even after I'd already given up on it. Luckily, it's a sillier show where I'm not necessarily waiting for an ending. I'm still interested to find out if Sadao Mao and Emi Yusa can get back to their world, but I admit the charm of the show is seeing them struggle in modern Japan. that makes it easier to get into, as opposed to diving into a much more dramatic narrative. For those types of stories, we genuinely have to ask if they're worth the wait. If I could go back in time and tell my past self how long I'd be waiting on the conclusions of certain anime, it might provoke my past self to not even start watching in the first place. Sometimes that desire for closure is the only thing making a story worthwhile. Inuyasha was one such story, as it definitely overstayed its welcome. Between speculation and the conclusion of different Inuyasha video games, we already had a pretty good idea of what the end would look like. We just needed it to finally happen, which is why I feel the final act would be better named as "It's Finally Over!" The scariest thing is that the longer it takes for a new chapter to come out, the more demanding and critical we become of it. We expect that wait to be worthwhile, but knowing what to expect can also be a challenge. Take the game series Shenmue, for instance. The first game came out on the Dreamcast around 1999, and a sequel emerged on Xbox in 2001. In many ways, these two games were way ahead of their time, incorporating sandbox elements that wouldn't become mainstream until another console generation later. As such, they were expensive and didn't sell nearly as well as they needed to. Because of this, what was written to be a longer series just ended on a cliffhanger. Our protagonist, Ryo Hazuki, despite 2 entire games, had yet to take revenge on Lan Di for killing his father, and fans were left in the dust. With the power of crowdfunding, however, Shenmue's creators were able to begin development on a 3rd installment after 14 years of silence. The finished product wouldn't release until another 4 years later, and by then, the gaming climate had changed quite a bit. Personally, I think there was confusion about what Shenmue 3 was even supposed to be. It's safe to say that the fans wanted closure, a 3rd game that could finally put the story to rest. It's why the game's dated mechanics, graphics, and voice acting were initially tolerated by the fanbase, as it felt like this 3rd game was trying to feel like it had come out much earlier, as if nothing had changed between installments. Had the game concluded the series under this style, it would have been received well. Those dated elements would have been charming. Obviously, that didn't happen. Just as much as Shenmue 1 and 2, Shenmue 3 ends without Ryo's awaited confrontation with his nemesis, leaving fans to wonder what the point of a 3rd game even was. After all, Shenmue's spiritual successors, such as the Yakuza series, have vastly improved that open-world formula over the years. Nostalgia for the story aside, there are many parts of those games that easily outshine Shenmue in terms of quality. If the devs wanted to legitimately make Shenmue relevant again, they needed to put in a lot more work than they did. In my opinion, they wasted their one chance to send the series off in style. Even if a 4th game manages to do so, I doubt it will have the impact it deserves, because fans have officially waited too long. The last thing I want to talk about in this video is what effect these long waits have on the average anime fan. I feel like millennials and onward generations are much more connected to their fictional escapism than ever before. We're very much attached to the stories we invest in, and that degree of immersion plays a larger role in our daily lives than generations prior. I once thought that one day I would grow out of this stuff, that my career and family would eventually render my obsession with anime obsolete. When I was a teenager, my primary role was to study, and media filled those other gaps in my life. I thought that as I got older, those gaps would be filled by other obligations, and I suppose for some people, that's exactly what happened. For me, however, I noticed my interest in different anime and games fluctuating over the years, and rather than it declining, it's actually risen, and I couldn't be happier about that. Like I said, part of why I keep living is to experience those new works, and to see older works finally come to fruition. If a series like Berserk is going to take over 30 years to finish, that just means I'll have to remain an anime fan for that long. This is especially interesting for works that appeal to teens and children. There was a time when Misty, or Kasumi from Pokemon, was older than I was. She seemed more mature, and I had a youthful attraction to that maturity. Admittedly, the Pokemon manga certainly helped with that. Those feelings haven't exactly gone away, nor have they been allowed to mature, because the Pokemon characters are more or less trapped in time. Stuff like this helps explain why so many Pokemon fans are thirsty for characters like Nessa, and why adults tend to imagine her as more mature than she might be written as. Same goes for Sailor Moon. They were older women when I first learned of them, and it's crazy seeing myself age past them. In many ways, I've moved beyond them, but there's also a part of me that still sees the Sailor Guardians that way. I'm now older than both Cloud and Tifa, and yet, while I'm playing the remake, I don't consider that consciously. If I play a game starring as a kid, I'll still project my adult self onto them, the same way that South Park's kids deal with adult themes that far outclass their maturity. I can pick up an anime or game I experienced in high school and experience it from a perspective that, fundamentally, I haven't changed at all over those long years. Obviously, this is what it means to be young at heart. It's not a new phenomenon, but I do feel that the way we consume media over long periods of our lives helps explain why we're able to stay more youthful than older generations. Even when I become, say, a Zenkichi or even a Master Roshi in life, I'll probably still identify as an Ash Ketchum or Cloud Strife. This attachment to youthful stories and fascinations, caring about our fictional media over the span of decades, really helps explain why there are both anime fans and creators who are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, experiencing or making stories about Japanese teenagers long after we've outgrown that demographic. Naturally, this isn't to say we should toss caution to the wind and live as irresponsible children, but it is a cultural wake-up call to the idea that, say, animated films are only for kids, and that growing up means abandoning fun and working ourselves to death, using booze and cigs to carry us through the day. Hopefully by now, I've given you all a lot to think about. Going into discussion, I want to ask you all about your own experiences with anime stories spread out over decades of your lives. What's the longest you've ever waited on an anime or game? Have you found yourself keeping up with the story just to see how it ends, despite no longer being interested otherwise? Has growing up on anime changed how you perceive yourself and your adult sensibilities? Which anime or games are you still holding out on, even though you've gone through many life changes while waiting? I'd love to hear your answers and other thoughts on the topic in the comments below.
Thanks for watching!
If you enjoy this channel, help us grow by liking, commenting, sharing the video, subscribing to Otaku Daikun, and
most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of our anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content.
You can support us directly through Patreon, Subscribestar, or our YouTube membership, all of which come with benefits like exclusive vids and early access.
As always,
Celebrate your fandom!